Hey everybody, this is a piece by Cornelius Castoriadis that is titled On the History of the Workers' Movement. This was originally written in 1974. Let's party. It is impossible to separate workers' demands and their forms of organization and struggle from questions of political organization, the question of the party. It is tantamount to accepting and legitimating the idea of two fields of reality separated in fact and in principle. In the one, workers are concerned with their immediate demands, trying to achieve them through specific forms of struggle, and regrouping in organizations with well-defined objectives, essentially trade unions. The other field is dominated by militants who, qualitatively different from the workers, define themselves by a coherent ideology and a corresponding, quote, maximum program, and who organize around issues only insofar as they can be instrumental in achieving the organizer's own ends. How then are these two fields connected? Only in this way the workers' concerns from one of the various tactical Only in this way the workers' concerns form one of the various tactical problems faced by the militants, problems which are, in turn, themselves inserted in the development of their strategy. In other words, militants need to know how the workers' immediate struggles can be influenced by the militants' ideas and political organization, and how the workers' demands can be made to transcend their immediate nature, rising to the level of the organization's more, quote, historical concerns. But once this distinction is brought into the open, it collapses under the weight of the incoherence and incompatibility of the various assumptions that it entails. The distinction presupposes a series of separations between the, quote, economic and the, quote, political, between these two spheres and the whole of social life, and between the, quote, immediate and the, quote, historical. While these separations have a certain validity, they are meaningless from both a theoretical and above all a revolutionary perspective. They necessarily relegate the proletariat only to its immediate economic interest, even if this idea does not always take the extreme form of Lenin's What is to be done, which holds that the working class, left to its own devices, can only attain a trade union consciousness. At the same time, this distinction proclaims the proletariat to be the agent of an unprecedented revolutionary change. Footnote. This last antinomy and corresponding reduction of the proletariat into a blind instrument of historical reason, capital R, marks the attitudes of all Marxists. It is exemplified by all those who, from Luxemburg to the, quote, council communists, end quote, emphasize the spontaneity of the masses, while at the same time, quote, scientifically demonstrating the inevitability of an economic collapse of capitalism. One can appreciate their, quote, subjective attitude more readily than that of the Leninists, but this does not prevent them from remaining within the same universe of thought, and even from being less coherent than the Leninists. The bureaucratic logic of the position of a 1903 type Leninist is clear. By themselves, workers can only undertake trade union activities. The action of the party can awaken only a small number to political life, and therefore only a crisis of the system that reduces the proletarian masses to misery and unemployment can make them understand the correctness of the party program. But why did Luxemburg feel obligated to demonstrate that capitalist accumulation sooner or later would reach an absolute limit? What led some of her followers, such as Leroy and Sternberg, to search for the precise date when this limit would be reached? That's referring to Lucien Leroy and Fritz Sternberg. I have a piece on here from Fritz Sternberg, not from Fritz Sternberg, but about Fritz Sternberg's views of the Soviet Union. I might have something on this channel about Lucien Leroy's conception of the Soviet Union on here that's also from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union, but I might not. Lucien Leroy, I think, had something akin to a bureaucratic collectivist theory of state of the USSR prior to a lot of people that are typically associated with third camp Trotskyism, such as the young James Burnham, Max Shachtman, and Joseph Carter. So, back to the text. Why is it that only an economic collapse of capitalism can bring out the masses' otherwise unlimited revolutionary potential? End footnote. It is important, however, to see the reasons behind these separations, in particular the one that historically governs them all, that between the quote immediate and the quote historical. This distinction underlies the position of those politician-theoreticians who see themselves as scientific strategists, treating workers' activity as a given in the tactical problem that history has charged them with solving. What such a position implies is that the past, present and future truth of historical evolution is the possession of an essentially closed theory, itself possessed by a political organization. It necessarily follows that the, quote, historical role of the proletariat, end quote, exists as such only to the extent that the proletariat does what the theory knows and predicts it must do. Thus, what is at work here is not simply, nor even essentially, the capitalist axiom concerning the primacy of the economic. Rather, it is the axiom of sovereignty of theory which underlies all of Western history. Quote, the question is not what this or that proletariat, or even the whole of the proletariat at the moment considers as its aim. The question is what the proletariat is, and what consequent on that being, it will be compelled to do, end quote, wrote the young Marx. Footnote, the Holy Family, end footnote. But who knows what the proletariat is? Marx in 1945, or even in 1967? Question mark. Where is this being of the proletariat which will compel it to do what it must? Only in Marx's head. In this respect, what is the difference between all those philosophers whom Marx mercilessly mocks because they make world history pass through their own thought and Marx himself? There is none. Quote, what this or that proletarian, or even the whole of the proletariat considers, end quote, is the immediate phenomenal appearance masking the essence. Theory alone provides access to this essence and to the interpretation of the more or less contingent appearances, e.g. what the proletariat might consider as its aim. Theory alone can allow one to recognize whether the proletariat acts on the basis of what it regards as its aim, or under the constraints of its essence. At what moment, then, can one speak of the proletariat's autonomy or creativity? At no time. Least of all at the moment of the revolution, since for the proletariat that is the moment of absolute ontological necessity, when history finally compels it to manifest its essence, which the proletariat had hitherto ignored, but which others knew. But at least isn't Marx autonomous when he says this? No, he is himself bound to Hegel, Aristotle, and Plato. He theorizes on the essence of the proletariat, examines its composition, and discovers its hidden power that will necessarily become revolutionary. It is only natural that this leads to the perpetuation of a speculative stance. Only the words change over the epochs, with the philosopher king now hailed as the revolutionary leader. Footnote. It is striking to note that both Lukács and Gramsci, each in his own way, theorized this position in the 1920s under the cover of an invocation to praxis. End footnote. It is not easy to break with an attitude that, much more than opinions, external influences, in particular socio-historical relations, is rooted in what we have regarded for over 3,000 years as being knowledge and truth, an attitude, furthermore, viewed as necessary for thought itself. The conclusion which we must draw from this is surprising. The question of the history of the workers' movement has never been seriously posed. What is generally presented as its history is only a description of factual sequences or, at best, an analysis of this or that great event, the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, June 1936, etc. But the interpretation of the whole of these facts and events, the question of the meaning of the developments over the last 2 or even 6 centuries, in a growing number of countries is far less frequent. There is the Stalinist hagiography, e.g. the history of the CPSU, which is the short course on the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, I think is what it's being referred to, which was completely controlled by the party itself, and by the state itself. If you listen to, I recommend listening to the piece that's on this channel by James D. White, entitled "The Road to," it's either like "The Road or the Path to the Short Course," which is about the calcification, the crystallization of Stalinist historiography in the USSR, particularly pertaining to the history of the Soviet Union. Historians who discussed about different subjects in the history of the Soviet Union had more freedom to operate than people who were more concerned with immediate Russian history. There's the Stalinist hagiography, e.g. the history of the CPSU, which shows the ingenious engineer on the locomotive of history, driving it forward despite the ambushes and obstacles planted on the rails by capitalists and their spies. There's also the Trotskyist melodrama, in which a proletarian revolution, objectively right for over 60 years, is on the verge of success, but fails each time because of the errors and betrayals by the poor leaders that it has inexplicably chosen. There are the variations on a theme by certain philosophers as foreign to the revolutions as to Marxism, yet are solicitous of both. They raise the idea that universal history may have been derailed since 1923, and seem to want to grasp the truth of a century of history as a subproduct of a new reading of the 1844 manuscripts or the 1857 Grundrisse. Of course, there's an immense literature on the history of the workers' movement in a given country or during a given period, but with only rare exceptions, they belong to what is more properly called the history of events. Footnote. Among these exceptions is E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. End footnote. The dates of strikes and insurrections replace those of battles, the names of leaders or heroic militants those of kings and generals. Sometimes the accent is on the activity of the masses, which is more satisfying but scarcely qualitatively different. While this hagiography is certainly important, its limits hardly need to be pointed out. There is also a literature which, like historiography, deals with the statistical, economic, sociological, and cultural analysis of situations surrounding events relating to the proletariat. For lack of a better term, it can be called analytical historiography, and its importance can be disputed even less than in the preceding case. Obviously, it is essential to know the quantitative evolution of the proletariat, its proportion in the total population, its geographical, industrial, and professional distribution, its internal differentiation, and the changes it has undergone, the disappearance of old trades and the appearance of new trades, the evolution of living standards and lifestyles, and so on. And it is important to link these phenomena to each other and to the general evolution of capitalism and its aspects that most affect the worker's condition. Technical changes, economic cycles, secular transformations of social organization, etc. Without such knowledge, one has no access to the object. But just what is this object? This question is always present in historical research, even if historians ignore it or act as if the response were self-evident. Whatever the particular field, historians invariably postulate the existence of a historical entity that supports the unity of their work. To be sure, it appears to the historians as bearing almost exclusively on the frontiers of the particular subject, i.e., as an essentially negative question. What doesn't belong to this field? Where does such a period end, etc.? But obviously much more is at stake. This is only the other side of a position that has not been made explicit, and it is this that concerns us. Before proceeding further, let us briefly digress. Our subject matter is the history of the workers' movement. There is no way for us to discuss this, however, without considering a number of issues that would likely appear abstract, philosophical, useless, and even deserving of scorn by those who claim to be interested only in action and struggle. But perhaps such people should stop for a moment and try to measure the huge weight of a naive metaphysics conveyed by the smallest phrase in their the smallest phrase in their tracts, by the seemingly most simple and solid idea that they have in their heads. It has been noted before that capitalists and ministers of finance both like to think of themselves as, quote, men of action, and believe that their ideas on liberalism, budgetary equilibrium, and the gold standard are the solid teachings of reality and practice, which allow them to disregard more nebulous and doctrinaire theories, forgetting that what they profess is itself only the nebulous theory of some 18th century economists diluted to the nth degree. The least intelligent scientists snigger when one draws their attention to the philosophical questions that are at the very basis of their activity. The only reason that they are immersed in a metaphysical ocean so deep, full of such fantastic constructions as, quote, things, quote, causes, quote, effects, quote, space, quote, time, quote, identity, quote, difference, etc., is that they are obviously unable to see in it. But even more serious is the case of the militant who speaks constantly of classes, historical laws, revolutions, socialism, productive forces, state and power, while curious believing that in these words and in his handling of them ideas have no part. As a result, the militant is totally enslaved to theoretical and philosophical conceptions whose meaning has been determined in the past. All the more so, since the militant does not want to know what these conceptions are, where they come from, and finally, where they lead. Where they lead. If I repeat something, it's in italics, if I haven't said that, if you've never listened to me read something before. Let us look more concretely at this problem. What, for example, is Rome? What is the nature and origin of this unity that one inevitably postulates when speaking of the, quote, history of Rome? What is the relation that brings together plebeian struggles from the 5th to the 2nd century BC? The organization of the legions and the jurisdictio of the praetors. Praetors? I don't know what the hell that means. It says, I don't know how to say this. Praetor. It looks like praetor. That's how you say it. The praetor. I don't know. Praetor was the little title granted by the government of ancient Rome to a man acting in one of two official capacities. 1, the commander of an army. 2, as an elected magistrate, assigned to discharge various duties. The functions of the magistracy. The praetorship, are described by the adjective itself. The praetoria potestas, praetorian power. The praetorium imperium, praetorian authority. The praetorium ius, praetorian law. The legal precedents established by the praetors. Praetorium, as a substantive, denoted the location from which the praetor exercises authority, either the headquarters of his castra, the courthouse tribunal of his judiciary, or the city hall of his provincial governorship. The minimum age for holding the praetorship was 39 during the Roman Republic, but it was later changed to 30 in the early empire. Okay, so back to the text. Let me reread that last sentence. What is the relation that brings together plebeian struggles from 5th to the 2nd century BC, the organization of the legions and the jurisdictio of the praetors, the discourses of Cicero, the development of the colonies, and Hadrian's Wall? All this, quote, belongs to the history of Rome, but in what sense? Evidently a combination of heterogeneous external criteria, inherited most of the time from a, quote, scientific tradition, circumscribes the historian's daily work. This mundane example reveals not only problems in the question of historical construction, but also the non-conscious metaphysics that commonly underlies, quote, scientific attitudes. Not one of these elements, when taken separately, is decisive, nor is there any combination that provides the necessary and sufficient conditions for the constitution of Rome as a historical object. Yet, on the other hand, if this unity is posed as a sequence of, quote, causations, quote, influences, and, quote, interactions, any cutting up of the connections is necessarily arbitrary to a certain degree. Such a cutting up must be justified if one does not want to make the historical object into the historian's artifact. The recognition of this degree of arbitrariness usually leads to an extremism quite akin to positivism and pragmatism, which holds that facts are fashioned by consciousness out of the amorphous matter of the given. The historian, like the physicist, would impose organization onto chaos, the principles of which would stem from the requirements of one's theoretical consciousness. While this view is already untenable when dealing with nature, where consciousness cannot arbitrarily fashion anything nor guarantee that the forms it constructs will find a, quote, corresponding material, it becomes simply absurd when dealing with society and history. Here it is the, quote, material itself which is organized and organizing. Consider, more generally, what is at the heart of every socio-historical formation? The complex of imaginary social significations in and by which it organizes itself and its world. That is, socio-historical formations constitute themselves in the first place by establishing a complex of terms and reference, quote, significations, which are imaginary inasmuch as there is no real or rational basis for them, and which are social inasmuch as they are valid for all members of the formation. Theoretical analysis can dissect and reconstruct the superficial manifestations of the life of a given formation, showing, for example, that the most important connections are not always found where the participants may believe them to be. But ultimately it will find that the principal decisive moment of the latent organization will still be this complex of imaginary significations, whose continuous modifications forms a decisive dimension of the organization's history. The historian's analysis cannot be free of this. Far from our own reconstructions being free, the unresolvable difficulties that are encountered when describing the significations of other times and places in terms comprehensible to us bear witness to that which, independent of our constructions, resists them. However ingenious the theoretician, the material, the object itself, prevents one from perceiving unlimited expansion as a central signification of Balinese culture, for example, or holiness as a dominant signification of capitalist culture. No philosophical or epistemological trick can eliminate the existence of the socio-historical object, nor mask the fact that Rome, Athens, the Peloponnesian War, feudal Europe, Romantic music, and the Russian Revolution exist or have existed as much, if not more, than tables, galaxies, and topological vector spaces. Those who are unable to see this should abstain from talking about society and history and occupy themselves with mathematics, crystallography, and entomology, while carefully avoiding theoretical questions even in these fields. One must today be wary of that stance wherein reality is presented as obeying a few impoverished rules of conceptualization, computation, and, quote, structural tabulation. Thus, the question we now face concerns the character of the socio-historical object. To return to our earlier example, the question begins as, in what sense and why does this inexhaustible series of facts belong to the history of Rome? And ends with, what is it that perpetuates itself for 10 centuries as Rome? This question, of course, cannot be confused with nor absolutely separated from the question of how Rome presents itself to other socio-historical entities and is perceived by them, including our own understanding of Rome. Our discourse today exists by virtue of our understanding of Rome, of course, but this is in turn possible only if something initially gives itself as Rome. At the same time, we must ask why this question has until now been relentlessly suppressed. That which has perpetuated itself for 10 centuries as Rome does not possess a name in any language, and, indeed, could hardly have one. It is certainly not a fiction, nor is it a scientific invention, nor is it a, quote, thing, quote, subject, or, quote, concept. It is not a simple composite of subjects, a group, or crowd. It is the history of Rome that materially, juridically, and ontologically produces the Romans, as much as the Romans produce the history of Rome. It is by virtue of Rome's history that the Romans acquire their essence. Nor is this history a set of definite institutions, since these are in perpetual flux, and Rome's history obtains, above all, by its ability to find the resources to modify its institutions, thus making its perpetuation possible. Instead, Rome is a socio-historical object whose irreducible specificity has never been recognized by inherited thought. The socio-historical object, when it has not been pulverized into a cluster of empirical determinations, can only be spoken of in terms of a metaphysics foreign to it. This, however, is not an accidental deficiency, but only the hallmark of inherited thought, which can only know 3 primitive types of being: the thing, the subject and the concept, or idea, and their junctions, combinations, elaborations, and syntheses. The socio-historical object, however, absolutely cannot be grasped in this framework. Let's now try to situate this idea in relation to 3 authors, Aristotle, Hegel, and Marx. Footnote. For more details on this, see my Institution Imaginaire, or Imaginary Institution. Where am I? End footnote. Excuse me, sorry. Aristotle has long been regarded, in a sense correctly, as the father of, quote, holism, the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its, quote, parts. Aristotle formulates this idea in the Politics. The city, polis, naturally preceded the individuals comprising it. But why, quote, naturally? Aristotle carefully specifies his meaning here. Nature is end. What is then the nature, the end, that the city is to bring about? Quote, the city arises for the sake of mere life, but persists for the sake of a good life, end quote. It has a final cause both in its being and becoming. The human individual cannot live outside the city's, quote, becoming, and cannot live the good life outside the city's, quote, being. The city comes to exist in order to make human life possible. Its factual existence, therefore, precedes the factual existence of human individuals. However, the city, quote, exists in order to make the good life possible. It is therefore conceivable that the city develops out of a composition of human individuals, since it precedes them. But the city's essence is defined by its end, as are all essences, which is, namely, the good life of individuals. The essence of the city, then, is defined by reference to its goal, which is in turn defined by the accomplishment of the individual subject, i.e., the good life. All the considerations must be subordinated to this. The city draws its true being from the fact that it is the precondition for the existence of individuals who are to live the good life. The ethical goal of the good life constitutes the essence of the city and grounds its being. From the most elevated viewpoint, the city is because man is an ethical subject, and in order that he can realize himself as such. What are the roots of this thought? The incontestable character of the idea of the priority of one term in relation to another, therefore, the demand that a hierarchical order always be established between them. Less apparent but even more influential is the consequence that if everything must be thinkable, all the terms must be on the same order, or else one order must predominate above all others. Thus, to the extent that several orders appear, notably causal and final orders, the differences between them must be abolished, either by subordinating one to the other or by demonstrating that in truth they are on the same order. Hegel and Marx will follow this second alternative. Aristotle followed the first by posing final causation as the ultimately determining order. The difference separating these thinkers, however, is less important than would initially appear. Finality is posed by Aristotle as an ethical goal immanent in the individual subject. Later, finality will be replaced by the world spirit or by all of humanity, at the same time as the actual contents of this finality will be enlarged. Consequently, in every case, socio-historical activity can never be seen as existing for itself. Rather, socio-historical activity must always refer to an ethical finality as good or bad, conceivable and measurable according to norms that are ranked in relation to a sovereign good, whose concrete representation and interpretation will obviously vary throughout the course of history. But is such reasoning really convincing? The socio-historical has no relation with this finality, however it may be defined. Rome is not for anything. Rome is not for anything, and of course not for itself. Rome is or has been, that is all. It is true that our world and our discourse would not be what it is had Rome not existed, but for all that we cannot establish ourselves as its end. Certainly Aristotle, who did not like infinite regression, would have thought such reasoning to place our own raison d'etre in the lives of those who follow us, and so on. It is possible that the good life of the individual is the supreme ethical and political end, but we cannot reduce the socio-historical to this goal, nor can we limit our attempt to understand what makes itself in history to a comparison, say, of actual cities and the ideal of the good city, nor forget that the ideal itself is a product of history, as is the ideal of the good life, and so on. And if the socio-historical must always be conceived with reference to an end, it should always be conceivable with reference to a global configuration in which all goals are ordered. This configuration could only be an organized community, what Aristotle calls the polis, or called the polis. And what we can call a determinate people or society, in any case, to return to the Platonic and Aristotelian term, an autarkic or self-sufficient collectivity. The political community should be able to subsume under its logic and ontology all that appears in its history. Thus the economy is and must be treated in the politics. But this is not possible. The global configuration of the autarkic and politically unified community, be it a tribe, city, people, empire, or the community of all humanity, is not something to which all other socio-historical configurations are necessarily and intrinsically subordinated. The Dionysian cult or Buddhism, the English language or the capitalist enterprise, the Baroque or Western science since the Renaissance, Romanticism or the workers' movement, these cannot be grasped as moments in the life of a political community or plurality of such communities, and even less, obviously, as conceivable in a well-determined network of goals, be they ethical or anything else. This situation is not essentially altered by Hegel, despite the enormous expansion and revolution he otherwise effected. Hegel only consolidated the Aristotelian framework, making it capable of receiving 20 more centuries of experience. For our purposes here, Hegel pushed the Aristotelian problematic and its responses to their limits. He went as far as possible in Aristotle's logico-ontological framework without causing it to burst. Certainly the autarkic community is explicably historicized, and as such ceases in a sense to be autarkic. Thus, what might appear in Aristotle as a simple and inorganic juxtaposition, a coexistence or succession of factual cities without any ordered relation between them, appears organized in Hegel. The question that Aristotle does not raise, why and for what are there several cities, becomes Hegel's central concern. But Hegel is only responding to an exigency posed in principle by Aristotelian thought. He is filling up a void in Aristotle by submitting historical succession to the schema of hierarchical order. By incorporating the idea of finality into this order, and by answering the why of the existence of several cities, namely, owing to the progressive and dialectical realization of reason in history. Certainly the specific configuration of the city is transcended, people become central in history. This is made necessary not only by the accumulation of empirical data confronting Hegel, but also by more profound considerations linked to the persistence and generalization of Aristotelian schemas. The ethical finality conferred onto the individual and the good life must be surpassed, because they are doubly limited by the particularity of the individual and that of the ethical moment. Ultimately, however, they are led back into the universal finality of reason which is, as Hegel says, quote, an operation conforming to a goal, end quote. This reason should not and could not be limited by anything external. It must be present in all manifestations of historical life. The political organization, or state, although it has a privileged character, is still only one of these manifestations, and of course the city is not its universal form. One requires an intermediary configuration that unifies them all at a given historical stage, i.e. the people. Footnote. Even more, this necessarily concerns a historical people, that is to say, world historical. There are very few such peoples, and it is difficult to see the philosophical foundation for the existence of the remainder. Perhaps one should recall a famous paragraph from the Philosophy of Right, according to which all that is not reality posed by reason is external appearance, illusion, and error, and then decide to include among these illusory appearances the Incas, Huns, Africans, Japanese, Indonesians, and several others. It is not without interest to note that when, after 40 years of philosophy, Husserl was finally led by the crisis of modern science and the rise of Nazism to suspect the existence of history, he would attempt to understand it by referring it to the innate telos of European humanity. Asia is without a quote why, as the poet would say. How strange, this necessity innate to a certain kind of philosophy that allows it to speak, poorly, of only 1/4 of what is, while excluding from existence the other 3/4. End footnote. All manifestations of historical life become, quote, moments in the life of the people, end quote, and are coordinated and subordinated to the people's historical activity and existence. They are the, quote, spirit of the people, embodied and visible. This, quote, spirit of the people, like the, quote, world spirit, of which it is a moment, is certainly not a subject in the usual sense of the term. Yet both are subjects in a much stronger Hegelian sense. It should be recalled that, quote, the absolute is subject, end quote. What matters is not this or that interpretation of the ontological category of subject, but the category itself, which here reabsorbs all limitations and is equal to being itself. The opposition between reality and concept has been raised here to the level of an expanded totality, completely embracing all that can be thought. But this does not prevent that which can be thought from being thought in the mode of activity reflecting upon itself and operating with a view to the ends it poses, which is the definition of both subject and Hegelian reason. Footnote. What is being discussed here is the elevation of the category of subject to an ontological prototype, not its legitimacy in its own right. Thus one should not confuse this critique with certain fashionable oratory exercises, proclaiming the death of the subject after that of man. End footnote. Where am I? Socio-historical being thus refers to the, quote, life of this enlarged subject, the, quote, historical people, and ultimately to the absolute subject, reason or world spirit. These are seen as articulating a teleology, i.e. an ethical hierarchy. This hierarchy has two levels. It must rank the moments in which economy, law, religion, and art have a well-defined place, and it must rank the historical peoples themselves, e.g., maintain that Christianity is superior to Buddhism, modern philosophy is superior to that of the ancient Greeks, and that the Prussian monarchy is the perfect form of the state. In this domain, as in all others, the profound dynamis of Aristotelian logic is not only maintained in its entirety by Hegel, it is completed. It is completed. Elsewhere I have shown that Marx remained within the Hegelian framework in his theory of history. Footnote. Marxisme et théorie révolutionnaire. I guess that's Marxism and revolutionary theory. And there's a footnote I missed here. By means of this completion, Hegel minimized the effect of that which Aristotle sought to emphasize at his highest moments, e.g. in the Metaphysics and On the Soul, namely the aporetic, the recognition of a final division, of the limits to logos, and of the inaccessibility of the divine perspective. Unfortunately, we cannot go further into these questions here. End footnote. But when Marx began to write economic and political history, his framework started to break down. After a century of Marxist literature and Marxology, these historical analyses still require theoretical articulation. If it were to be done, however, it would produce a theory of interpreter and not of Marx, of the interpreter and not of Marx. It would run against the explicit conception of history that Marx formulated, beginning with the German ideology and continuing through the rest of his work. Marx's dependence on Hegelian schemas appears clearly when one considers his view on universal history, where everything communicates and concurs with everything else, a position that he received from Hegel without perceiving it as problematic. Hegel, however, provided a philosophical basis for this position while Marx did not. At the heart of this history, the configuration of the universal mode of production and the classes corresponding to it plays the role of the, quote, historical people, while that of the necessary stages in humanity's development plays the role of the moments in the realization of the idea. The double hierarchical network imposed by Hegel on the succession of peoples and on the border borne by the, quote, moments of their life, end quote, was taken over by Marx lock, stock, and barrel. Hegel saw in the forms of European societies of his time the fully developed necessary moments of what had always been there potentially. Similarly, Marx projected these forms onto the whole of past history, going so far as to assert that their fundamental interrelations were identical in the past to that which they had then become, even though these forms had not yet been realized as distinct. Of course, Marx reversed the algebraic signs, replaced spirit with matter or nature, and he boasted about having put the Hegelian dialectic on its feet. But nothing in all this affects the logic at work here. The distinction between spirit and matter is meaningless if both are conceived as sets of perfectly assignable rational determinations, as both Marx and Hegel respectively conceived them. One learns early in mathematics that the structures included on the same set by two opposed relations of order are isomorphic. In other words, that the determination of the superstructure by the infrastructure, or the inverse, comes to the same thing. Inherited logical and ontological schemas always operate in the organization of the, quote, newest concepts that Marx placed at the center of his theory. Thus, according to one of his seemingly most anti-Hegelian formulations, quote, concrete labor should replace, quote, abstract spiritual labor. But how did Marx really think of labor? As a completed operation by a subject on a thing according to concepts, or as a system of completed operations of a universe of subjects on a universe of things according to an ideal system? Quote, what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. He not only effects a change of form in the materials on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law his modus operandi, in which he must subordinate his will, end quote. Dozens of Marxists have cited this passage in order to demonstrate that Marx was not only a materialist, but that, indeed, he was just as much a rationalist. The question concerning the origin of the idea for a project being contained in the worker's imagination should not be raised. If it were, it could receive only one response. The prior idea is a product of the rational elaboration by men seeking the means most appropriate to their ends. There are two types of such ends, both of which transcend technique and command it. There are those ends that men represent to themselves, but more importantly, there are those to which humans are themselves submitted, i.e. the ends immanent to the historical process, whose realization occurs in the development of, quote, productive forces. The, quote, mode of production must always be nearly optimal in regard to the existing conditions. When it ceases to be optimal, it is overthrown sooner or later and replaced by a more appropriate mode, already prepared in and by the preceding mode. But appropriate to what? To the development of productivity. Socio-historical systems, modes of production, grow as the quantity of goods that they can produce increases and as mankind's latent productive faculties become manifest. This growth defines the goal as the norm of optimalization, i.e. simple maximization. Here Marx is wholly under the sway of the imaginary significations central to capitalism. But these significations are in no way purely capitalist. Maximization, the ontological growth of society measurable by the potential social product, is accompanied by the enslavement of the very subject that it presupposes. The subject becomes lost in an alien and hostile ocean of things that it continues to produce. But this is only a moment, albeit a long one, in the cavalry of reason. This, quote, negative development will ultimately engender its, quote, positive opposite. Here we can see the Judeo-Hegelian influence on Marx. But this final opposition is not Judeo-Hegelian, it is Greek. The ultimate finality orienting the whole of historical development is the good life in this world. But this presupposes the liberation of man from production and labor. Yeah.
Brake lights are on.
Okay. The ultimate finality orienting the whole of historical development is the good life in this world. But this presupposes the liberation of man from production and labor, which are, according to Aristotle, vulgar and servile. Banasoi. Banasoi. I don't know, I can't find anything for it. Well, I can, but it's too long and it doesn't seem particularly relevant. But this presupposes the liberation of man from production and labor, which are, according to Aristotle, vulgar and servile, banasoi, and which, according to Marx, remain tied to the realm of necessity, a realm whose magnitude can be reduced but which cannot be eliminated or altered in character. There is no productive labor that could ever be noble. When mechanical looms are able to weave by themselves, there will no longer be a need for slaves. But as long as these looms require supervision, servile, benusic, and unfree activity will continue to be the price that liberty will have to pay to necessity. Even so, there remains something of reason in the promise of the good life. Even after the cunning of reason has played itself out, there is still providence. The ultimate realm of freedom, then, is guaranteed to us by historical necessity, unless, of course, everything should collapse into barbarism. The other great theme in Marx is clearly opposed to this view of history. This theme is found in his statement that, quote, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles, end quote. When presented as a universally true thesis covering all aspects of socio-historical activity, this is only partly and relatively valid, of course. But in posing this theme, Marx hit upon a new way of approaching socio-historical entities, a way, however, which he did not pursue to its end, held back as he was by the inherent ontology dominating his thought. The two concepts of, quote, historical materialism and, quote, class struggle are profoundly incompatible. As soon as one is taken seriously, the other is voided. Ultimately, is the concept of historical materialism which is fundamental to Marx's theoretical work. In this view, the class is only a product of the mode of production, which itself is a product of technical development, It does not really act, but is only acted upon. At best, it blindly reacts to what confronts it. The theory of the capitalist economy is elaborated through the discovery of the system's objective laws, which function unbeknownst to those concerned. This conception increasingly dominates and shapes Marx's research to the exclusion of the conception of class struggle between the capitalist and the proletariat. Class comes to be, quote, objectively defined by its relation to the organization of a given society's productive relations, entirely independent of any class initiative or activity, except insofar as such activity is implied by the class's position in the relations of production. Individuals are equivalent as a result of equivalent relations to the productive process that exists independently of their will. Hence, not only can class position be grasped by referring only to activity in the productive sphere, but all other spheres of activity as well can in principle be deduced strictly from this position, e.g., family, activity, moral behavior, political organization, and even the ideology of the bourgeoisie are determined only by the respective places of the authors of such activity vis-a-vis the relations of production. At the same time, however, certain classes with a, quote, historical role, end quote, such as the bourgeoisie or proletariat, are viewed essentially in terms of the activity by which they transform the situation that they encounter upon their arrival in history. Footnote: just as in the Hegelian system, there is the problem of non-quote historical end quote peoples and a necessary silence concerning them, there is in the Marxist system the problem of classes to whom quote no quote historical role end quote can be assigned, and hence a necessary silence concerning them. End footnote. But, of course, history is linked back to class activity, and even, in a canonical version, it must be rigorously subordinated to such activity, as stated by Marx in innumerable passages, beginning with that in the Holy Family cited earlier. But this is not sufficient, and Marx's historical analyses force us to go further. For example, the bourgeoisie, presented in so many lapidary formulas as the simple and passive result of a stage of technical development, historically exists in Marx's concrete descriptions only insofar as it internalizes this development with a veritable frenzy, subordinating everything else to it, destroying all obstacles until, quote, all that is holy is profaned, end quote, not stopping until everything has been quantified, reified, calculated, and rationalized, systematically exploiting the whole earth and forcing all aspects of human life to submit to the requirements of capital accumulation. One cannot, then, fail to recognize that the bourgeoisie itself creates, at least in part, the relations of production that in turn determine it as the bourgeoisie. Focusing back on the object itself, one sees that the, quote, birth, end quote, of the bourgeoisie and the formation of the first nuclei of artisans and traders does not correspond to any important and specific technological change, but to a change in the social division of labor existing under feudalism. Functions that had until then been absorbed or had atrophied under feudalism now came into their own. In short, the institution of the, quote, Berg, end quote, conditioned a new and accelerated technological evolution rather than vice versa. In fact, nothing that Marx said about the birth of the bourgeoisie refers to technological change, but rather to how the bourgeoisie organized the serfs and had escaped from the feudal domain. Rereading his description of another decisive moment in the history of the bourgeoisie, that of, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, one notes that the essential condition for the passage to capitalism was the, quote, emancipation, end quote, of a large quantity of the labor force, which then became available for employment in industry. The, quote, violent creation of a proletariat with neither hearth nor home, end quote, was essentially the result of a process entirely apart from technical development and even apart from the bourgeoisie proper. But in exploiting the power of the state to hasten the transition from feudal modes of production to a capitalist mode, the bourgeoisie becomes a socio-historical agent whose action far exceeds the framework outlined by its position in the relations of production, which would have confined it to accumulation at a snail's pace. In other words, the bourgeoisie actively works to establish new relations of production whose realization will finally transform it into a capitalist bourgeoisie. This description of primitive accumulation, therefore, presents both a deficit and a surplus in comparison to all theory that claims to reduce the birth of capitalism to the function of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions inherent in the productive forces. There is a deficit because the creation of the proletariat, the necessary condition for the passage to industrial capitalism, results from a process external to the period's bourgeois mode of production. 4. In relation to the, quote, immanent, end quote, logic of the mode of production, the proletariat's development is, quote, extrinsic, end quote, and accidental. The historical effectiveness of this mode of production, and therefore of the class corresponding to this mode of production, is limited by the necessary and simultaneous occurrence of another socio-historical factor heterogeneous to it. Above all, it is not sufficient to attribute the cause of this surplus to the simple fact of the bourgeoisie's existence. The social category of the bourgeoisie must adopt a definite behavior. It must devote itself to an activity in a manner far surpassing that imputed to it by virtue of its position in the given relations of production. The source of motivation for this activity can be located in the design of previously unknown and unimaginable relations. It is by means of this surplus that the bourgeoisie finally makes itself into a bourgeoisie in the full sense of the word. Only by going beyond the role strictly delineated by the situation it created for itself does it raise itself to the requirements of its, quote, historical role, end quote. In developing itself, it develops the relations of production, inasmuch it is truly possessed by the idea of their unlimited development, an idea, an imaginary signification, which is neither a perception of the real nor a rational deduction. When Monsieur Jourdain speaks without knowing it, this is not the prose rendition of a set of significations already inscribed in the, quote, infrastructure. Or rather, as long as this is all he says, he will remain Monsieur Jourdain. According to Wikipedia, le bourgeois gentilhomme, translated as the bourgeois gentleman, the middle-class aristocrat, or the would-be noble, is a 5-act comedy ballet, a play intermingled with music, dance, and singing, written by Molière, first presented on 14th of October 1670 before the court of Louis XIV at the Château of Chambord by Molière's troupe of actors. Subsequent public performances were given at the theatre of the Palais Royal beginning on the 23rd of November 1670. The music was composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully. The choreography was by Pierre Beauchamp. The sets were by Carlo Vigarini, and the costumes were done by Chevalier de Avril. La bourgeois gentilhomme satirizes attempts at social climbing and the bourgeois personality, poking fun at the vulgar, pretentious middle class and the vain, snobbish aristocracy. The title is meant as an oxymoron. In Molière's France, a, quote, gentleman was by definition nobly born, and thus there could be no such thing as a bourgeois gentleman. The play is in prose, except for the ballet openings, which are in verse. And that's the main character of this is Monsieur Jourdain. So that's what this references to. Back to the text. When Monsieur Jourdain speaks without knowing it, this is not the prose rendition of a set of significations already inscribed in the, quote, infrastructure, or rather, as long as this is all he says, he will remain Monsieur Jourdain. He will become a capitalist only when he begins to speak the language of a cruel epoch, a monstrous world, where the unlimited expansion of this infrastructure for its own sake will become, for the first time in history, intellectually conceivable, imbued with ideological value, and historically real. Thus, Marx's account does not present the activity of the bourgeoisie as completely determined by the state of the productive forces as it exists at a given historical point, but is incompletely determined by this state as it comes to be shaped by the bourgeoisie itself. In other words, the bourgeoisie makes itself inasmuch as it transforms the socio-historical situation in which it is initially placed, including not only the relations of production and productive forces, but the very way in which these productive forces exist, the historical context conducive to their continuous overturning, and even their definition. This activity can only be grasped by reference to this design or idea, this imaginary signification of the unlimited development of the productive forces. It matters little that this signification is largely unconscious, or to the extent that it is conscious, remains shrouded under an ideology distinguishing this development as the means to attain other ends, such as happiness and the good life for all of humanity. While this activity is certainly rooted in the previous situation of the bourgeoisie, it did not go beyond this situation. It would produce nothing. If it did not go beyond this situation, it would produce nothing other than its repetition, or, at best, its slow modification. But it could not have produced the historical changes that led to capitalism, as can be seen in the many instances where the bourgeoisie did not live up to its, quote, historical role, end quote, for a short time, a long time, or forever. But we need to take a closer look at this metaphor of the, quote, historical role. Obviously, it is not a neutral concept. Is there perhaps then a play which assigns such a role to this historical stratum, the bourgeoisie? Who is its author? Or perhaps are we witnessing a comédie dell'arte? But what tradition established the characters and the plot? Let's see if there anything comes up for this. Commedia dell'arte was an early form of professional theater originating from Italian theater that was popular throughout Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. It was formerly called Italian comedy in English and is also known as commedia alla maschera, commedia improvviso, and commedia dell'arte all'improvviso. Characterized by masked, quote, types, commedia was responsible for the rise of actresses such as Isabella Adriani and improvised performances based on sketches and scenarios. Commedia, such as The Tooth Puller, is scripted and improvised. Both scripted and improvised. Characters' entrances and exits are scripted. A special characteristic of commedia is the lazzo, a joke or, quote, something foolish or witty, end quote, usually well known to the performers and to some extent a scripted routine. Another characteristic of commedia is pantomime, which is mostly used by the character Arlecchino, better known as Harlequin. The characters of the commedia usually represent fixed social types and stock characters, such as foolish old man, devious servants, or military officers full of false bravado. The characters are exaggerated, quote, real characters, end quote, such as a know-it-all doctor called Il Dottore, a greedy old man named Pantalone, or a perfect relationship like the innamorati. Many troupes were formed to perform commedia, including I Gelosi, which had actors such as Isabella Adriani and her husband Francesco Andreini. Confidenti troupe Desioi troupe and Fedeli troupe. Commedia was often performed outside on platforms or in popular areas such as a piazza, town square. The form of theater originated in Italy, but traveled throughout Europe, sometimes as far away as Moscow. The genesis of commedia may be related to Carnival in Venice, where the author and actor Andrea Calmo had created the character Il Magnifico. the precursor of the vecchio, quote, old man, pantalone, by 1570. In the Flaminia Scala scenario, for example, il magnifico persists and is interchangeable with pantalone into the 17th century, while Calmo's characters, which also included the Spanish capitano and a il dottore type, were not masked. It is uncertain at what point the characters don the mask. However, the connection to Carnival, the period between Epiphany and Ash Wednesday, would suggest that masking was a convention of Carnival and was applied at some point. The tradition in northern Italy is centered in Florence, Mantua, and Venice, where the major companies came under the protection of the various dukes. Concomitantly, a Neapolitan tradition emerged in the south and featured the prominent stage figure Pulcinella, which has been long associated with Naples and derived into various types elsewhere, most famously as the puppet character Punch of the eponymous Punch and Judy shows in England. Back to the text. Or perhaps we're witnessing a commedia dell'arte, but what tradition established the characters and the plot? Maybe there is no hard and fast script, but only character improvisations. The impositions between the two irreconcilable concepts evoked above become manifest here. Either the historical role is only a figure of speech, an empty tautology, meaning simply that the world as it appears to the observer would not be what it is if the previous events had not been what they were, and if the different social strata had not done what they did. Or, and this is obviously what Marx had in mind, the expression asserts that historical development conforms to an order known to the speaker or interpreter of historical events, and that such events as well as the activities of social strata function to achieve an end that transcends them both, but which was nonetheless has always been present in principle, and in this case, both the image, and now it is much more than just an image, and the metaphysics that it rests on are unacceptable. But there is a certain necessity about this antinomy, as well as the movement by which Marx resolved it. The bourgeoisie's socio-historical existence appeared to him, in part, for what it is, a social stratum reacting to its situation in a manner that exceeds the given, defining itself by the transformative activity that it undertakes. The bourgeoisie's acts, forms of organization, values, and ideas, above all the effects of its activity over several centuries and in a large number of countries, form a single socio-historical figure, but such an entity has, strictly speaking, no status in the theoretical context to which Marx belonged. Its various manifestations are almost ephemeral. They appear as an accumulation of inconsistencies, as absurd challenges to conceptualization, no matter how, quote, dialectical, end quote, one would like to be. Thus, the unity of this entity cannot be conferred on it by the identity of the individuals composing it, nor by the similarity of the objective conditions in which the individuals may find themselves. Nor is it to be found to any greater extent in the actual relations of production. It is impossible, after all, to lump together the artisans and merchants of the 13th century with the big bankers of the 16th century and the factory owners of the 19th century. If this unity exists, then, it can only be conceived in terms of the similarity of this activity's results, which need not be material, but rather results whose significations are similar. These results reveal the bourgeoisie as a class that tends to unify the world on a bourgeois basis, mercilessly eliminating all earlier forms of social existence in order to create an organization ruled by one imperative, the unlimited development of the productive forces. In short, one could say that the unity of the bourgeoisie is to be found in its activity, which in turn is defined by the unity of the historical design that it achieves. But how can one define the contents of this design, a design which is nothing other than the undefinable, perpetual capitalist transformation of the world? After all, what is a design without a subject? At worst, it is an absurdity, at best a personification, an abuse of language.
The bourgeoisie's existence must be given an ontological and conceptual consistency. But the attempt to do this inevitably leads to operations resulting in the reduction of the bourgeoisie to the categories of objects, to forms of existence already known and investigated elsewhere. The object under investigation is not allowed to remain unique, nor can it simply be defined as the sum of specific differences. It becomes necessary to find a genus proximum to which it belongs. One must therefore construct a notion of classes, of which the bourgeoisie will be the one manifestation among many. These instances must share essential characteristics. The bourgeoisie, feudal lords, Roman patricians, and Chinese mandarins must be essentially analogous under the concept of class. Footnote. It goes without saying that I am concerned here with the logical necessities governing the construction of the concept of class for Marx's system, not the actual historical genesis of the concept which, as is well known, precedes Marx. End footnote. And this essence must refer to other specified essences or collections thereof, and finally be reduced to primary essences, things and subjects. Ideas are not important here, because Marx decided that, for better or worse, they only repeated the real, just as Plato had decided that the real, for worse rather than better, only repeated the ideas. Thus, the concept of class is defined in reference to the relations of production, which are, in the last analysis, relations between people mediated by things. The structure of the ontological relation between the essence and its manifestation guarantees that knowledge of the essence permits knowledge of the manifestations, with the essence producing only those manifestations proper to the essence, and inversely with those manifestations not determined by the essence being by definitional accidental. To say that the manifestations are determined by the essence signifies that the phenomena obey laws. The same cause always produces the same effect by virtue of the principle of identity. The class as being historically compels it to do what it must do, knowing its historical role. Knowing its being. We know the action of classes in history. Is the purpose of the historical role, then, to integrate a series of objects into the whole, in which each object has its place. Thus the object receives its final dignity. Its existence is tightly bound to the totality of what exists in two ways. First, the object has its necessary and sufficient causes in what has already been, and second, it has its final cause in what must be. It conforms as much of the logic that dominates the effects things have as it does with that which governs the acts of subjects. A fine concept of class is thus constructed, completely fictitious, a remarkable exploit that succeeds in imputing to all other historical classes bourgeois characteristics that they do not possess, while removing from the bourgeoisie that which gives it its being and unity. Lukács considered it unfortunate that Marx did not write the chapter on class that was to have completed capital. Perhaps one should ask if Marx could have written it. In truth, we can only grasp the existence of the bourgeoisie by reference to its socio-historical activity. This activity does not by nature ensure the tranquil functioning of the given, well-established relations of production, but rather causes, consciously or not, willingly or not, a historical transformation without precedent, beginning several centuries ago and continuing into the present. The being of the bourgeoisie can only be apprehended by reference to that which results from its activity. The relation between these results and the context in which they are achieved must be seen as an absolutely original and irreducible object and relation. It does not belong to an already given or constructible type of object or relation, but it brings about the emergence of a type suited uniquely to itself. Nor does it submit, except in a formal and empty way, to the determinations of the universal and particular. It creates its own conditions of intelligibility, not receiving them from anything else. In effect, we have here neither a goal pursued by subjects nor the result of any specifiable cause, even though causation and motivation are present almost everywhere. Nor is this process the, quote, dialectical production of a totality of significations, although significations continually emerge at all levels and in constant reference to each other. In short, the activity of the bourgeoisie produces a completely new socio-historical world. 1 second. The present stage of the becoming of the world appears as contemporary bureaucratic capitalism, which ties together all the threads of the past, and which contains all the as yet unreal threads leading away from it, some of which can already be located, and which will be woven into and modified by the future wherein other threads will be added to them, affecting the simultaneous modification and reinterpretation of the supposedly immutable past. Certainly, we do relate this activity of the bourgeoisie to a group of men in similar situations. In particular, men belonging to a specific social stratum, or, more precisely, to a sequence of social strata. But this situation, or rather objective characteristics, are here only reference points not unified into a concept. In order to be able to specify the sequence of social strata under consideration, it is necessary to shape these objective objective characteristics into a concept. But to do this, one would have to maintain that the bourgeoisie obtains its unity in these characteristics. No amount of juggling with the relations of production, however, would allow this term to adequately bring together the situation of 13th century artisans and merchants, 18th century manufacturers, and 20th century managers of multinational firms. Of course, the strata we have just listed are distinguished by characteristics relative to production or to the economy, but this does not correspond to an identity or similarity of their respective situations in the relations of production. It corresponds to a similar relation to production that all these strata share. To distinguish among soldiers, for example, by their rank simply presupposes that they all have a relation to the army, but not that they all have the same position in the army. The bourgeoisie itself creates this relation to production and to the economy. The sequence of social strata whose activity ultimately brings about the capitalist world allows their specification by reference to production, but this very fact itself is part of the changes effected by the bourgeoisie. I cannot specify Hindu castes, the quote, classes, unquote, of antiquity or feudal estates by referring to their respective situations in the relations of production. E.g., a citizen of Athens or Rome is not necessarily nor even generally a slave owner. I need to know other traits, religious, juridical, political, etc., but ever since the birth of the bourgeoisie, one's position in the relations of production becomes the most pertinent trait, ultimately relegating all other traits to the background. This brings us to the essential point. To define a concept of class valid for all socio-historical formations by reference to the relations of production is tantamount to stating that the type of relation which all other classes in history maintain to these productive relations is identical to that which the bourgeoisie maintains. This is outrageously false, because the bourgeoisie is the first class by which the relation to production emerges as fundamental, the class whose major concern is production, the class that defines itself as essentially concerned with production, the class that defines men's acts and their relations by reference to production. This explains why Marx, immersed as he was in bourgeois society, was able to see the whole of past history only within this perspective. Viewing production as the central, determinate concern of society, it is pointless to introduce here, as Marx did, the well-known Hegelian motif, saying that this relation to production was always fundamental, and that the bourgeoisie only made it explicit. The specific character of the capitalist era is precisely this unprecedented development of the productive forces and the destruction of all other interests, standards, and values in social life. And this would be impossible without the radical transformation of the relations of the bourgeois class, and all other classes, to production and to the other spheres of social life, a transformation which reduced the law of Moses and the prophets to, quote, accumulate, end quote. Even if one were to admit that the domination of other classes in history was imposed as a result of the state of the productive forces, which is false, it is clear that the bourgeoisie imposed itself by imposing the development of these forces on all society. We need only add that nothing in its initial objective situation forced the bourgeoisie to do so. All this is equivalent to saying that the activity and self-making of the bourgeoisie can only be grasped by reference to the imaginary significations that it embodies and realizes. In this sense, certain monarchs, nobles and landed proprietors, religious reformers, ideologues and scientists can and have belonged to the bourgeoisie, often much more so than the entire masses of traders and small shopkeepers. The bourgeois socio-historical transformation is possible and becomes comprehensible to us only in relation to the imaginary social significations that the bourgeoisie brings about and which in turn bring about the bourgeoisie. Indeed, it comes down to this, that over an entire geographical area and during a given period, the activity of men makes possible things which until then were socially impossible, makes logical things which were formerly absurd and incomprehensible. This activity is conditioned by new means orienting towards ends that would be meaningless according to the previous criteria. It invents new social expressions by which it organizes itself and develops myths and ideas which it uses to orient, reflect, and justify itself. This movement is in no sense determined by physical laws, as is, for example, the movement of molecules in the physical universe. Instead, it is what it is by means of all that which it is not. It is what it is by means of its unlimited and in part undefinable relations to objects, to acts of other individuals, still more to the collective and anonymous activity in which it is constantly immersed, and to the explicit ends which it proposes. But also and above all, it is what it is by means of its relation to the interminable chain of effects that it never masters, that which, in the given social context, renders it logical or absurd, efficacious or fruitless, praiseworthy or criminal. It exists by means of reference to that which it is not, i.e., its signification. Marx said that a machine is in itself no more capital than gold is in itself money. A machine is capital but only by virtue of that machine's insertion into a network of capitalist social and economic relations. This is the capital signification of the machine that can be gained or lost as a result of facts bearing no relation to the machine's physical or technical properties. Similarly, a gesture or series of gestures is never in itself labor. These significations form neither a quote set nor a quote hierarchy, nor do they obey the usual logical relations, belonging, inclusion, relations of order, etc. The only relation which they always carry with them is the single transitive relation, the referral. The only relation which they always carry with them is the simple transitive relation, the referral. It is for this reason, and because they cannot be treated as though they were, quote, clear and distinct, end quote, that I call these significations a, quote, a magma. This indicates that we are not dealing with rational significations, in which case they could be constructed by logical operations and would be subject to questions of truth and falsity, which obviously makes no sense. The relation of serf-lord is what it is. It can neither be proved nor disproved, nor are we dealing with significations of the real or of an abstract representation thereof, since it is by means of these significations that what comes to be represented. Indeed, in the last analysis, it is by means of these significations that anything whatever obtains its social existence. All this boils down to saying that the activity of the bourgeoisie brings about a new definition of reality, of what counts and what is to be discounted, hence, of what does not exist. This new definition is not written in books, but in human activity, their relations among themselves, their organizations and perceptions of what is, their striving towards that which has value, and also, of course, in the material objects they produce, use, and consume. This activity is the institution of a new reality, a new mode of socio-historical existence. It is this institution, unfolding for several centuries and still not yet terminated, which underlies and unifies the multitude of the secondary institutions in and by which it is orchestrated. It is only by reference to this primary institution that the form of institution itself, the contents of the instituted significations, and the concrete organization of the particular institutions in the capitalist era can be grasped in their historical specificity. The primary institution is creation. No causal analysis can predict it by referring to the state that preceded it. No series of logical operations can produce it conceptually. Of course, it emerges in a given situation. Among the creations of the still living past, it unfolds an innumerable quantity of them, and for a long time remains subjected to some of them. However, as the instituting activity of the bourgeoisie progresses, the meaning of what was originally conserved from the past is transformed, either catastrophically, as in Christianity with the Reformation, or gradually, by its insertion into a new network of relations and into a new reality. The most striking example of this second kind is the destiny of, quote, reason, becoming, quote, rationality, and then, quote, rationalization, end quote, through a movement in which Leibniz has had as much a part as Henry Ford. Footnote, that this, quote, rationalization, end quote, has nothing to do with any rationality is argued in my article, quote, sur le content du socialisme. I have all three parts of the content of socialism on this channel. It's from Castoriadis' collective works from, I believe it's in part, his social and political writings, part 1 and 2. Volumes 1 and 2, I mean. End footnote. This destiny will only be understood when the, quote, rationality, end quote, of modern times is viewed in conjunction with the central imaginary signification that the bourgeoisie imposes on the world, the unlimited development of productive forces. This signification is absolutely new. Certainly people have amassed wealth and hoarded treasures since time immemorial. For the bourgeoisie, however, is far more than a matter of unlimited acquisition in general. It is acquisition which must be realized not as the appropriation of part of a totality that remains constant, but as regular development and expansion. Such acquisition is impossible without the constant transformation of the already acquired productive forces and of the way in which value is imbued in them. It accepts no external social limit, nor can it remain a particular activity. It must involve the transformation and overturning of all spheres of social life, submitting them to the logic of the unlimited expansion of production, and, of course, it must involve the constant transformation of the instruments, objects, and organization of production itself. All this neither repeats, generalizes, nor particularizes previous historical situations. It can be deduced from or produced in terms of the latter. It cannot be deduced from or produced in terms of the latter, nor can it have been foretold or even imagined by some bygone poet or philosopher. The making of the bourgeoisie is a creation having its source in the imagination, a creation which manifests itself as the institution of capitalism. We can therefore learn nothing about this historical object, the bourgeoisie, by subsuming the bourgeoisie under a universal, the supposed concept of class. Such a subsumption is either formal and empty, the, quote, concept being only a jumble of distinguishing features, or it is fallacious, through the identification of non-identifiable objects. And inasmuch as the Marxian concept of class is nothing other than an abstraction from certain aspects of a reality which the bourgeoisie itself historically created for the first time, the Marxian subsumption is all the more fallacious. To think of the bourgeoisie as a, quote, class, in Marx's meaning, is either to think nothing or to rediscover in it what, distinguished as a universal, had already been, in part badly, extracted from this object, and which in fact corresponds to the latter's peculiarities. Let us finally consider our real question: what is the working class, the workers' movement, and its history? Two essential considerations make this question theoretically complex. First, for us, the working class is not simply a historical object like Rome, the Inca Empire, or Romantic music. The question of the working class and the workers' movement coincides largely with the question of the crisis of the society we live in and the struggle unfolding in it. In short, with the question of contemporary politics. Our problem, therefore, is not simply the epistemological or philosophical problem concerning the unity and mode of being of the working class. The question, quote, what is the proletariat, end quote, cannot be separated from the question, quote, what is politics today, end quote. We can only conceive of politics today in the perspective of a radical transformation of society, and the project of such a transformation has been historically affirmed and articulated by the history of the workers' movement. The second consideration is that the connection between these two questions has been made by Marxism. Indeed, Marxism not only claims to have the answer to the question of what a class is in general, and what the proletariat is in particular, but also assigns to the proletariat the historical task of transforming society. Marxism pretends to settle once and for all the questions of politics in general, reducing politics to whatever activity prepares for the proletariat's accession to power, ultimately resulting in the construction of a communist society. In other words, revolutionary politics today is only that which serves the proletariat's immediate and historical interest. Now, Marxism itself has exercised considerable influence on the workers' movement and has in return been influenced by the workers' movement to no less a degree. In fact, in certain countries and over a long time, the two have almost coincided. Yet for all that, one cannot for a single moment identify the two. It is impossible to speak of them as if they were one and the same thing, but it is also impossible to speak of the one without the other. One can neither ignore the Marxist conception of the proletariat, nor accept its pretense as the self-conception of the proletariat. Nor can one even reject this pretense entirely since, in a way, the Marxist conception of the proletariat has, for a few moments, actually been the proletariat's self-conception. To begin with, the proletariat is, in Marx's conception... Did I even start recording? I did. Alright. To begin with, the proletariat is, in Marx's conception, a class whose, quote, objective, end quote, status is defined by reference to the capitalist relations of production, a class, quote, in itself, end quote, as Trotsky would later say. At the same time, it is also a class defined by its historical role, the suppression of class society and the construction of a communist society. It will therefore become a class, quote, for itself, in the very act of suppressing itself as a class. But what is the connection between these two terms, and how is the passage from one to the other to be effected? For it is obvious that the proletariat is not, either in 1847 or 1977, a, quote, class for itself, end quote. If this passage must take place, it would constitute the real meaning of the proletariat's history. But how do we know that the passage must take place, or that the proletariat contains at least the possibility of achieving it? In other words, what can the Marxist conception tell us about the history of the workers' movement? It is striking to note that apart from this a priori possession of its meaning, Marxism can tell us nothing. I'm obviously not speaking here about the description and analysis of events. The objective status of the proletariat is that of an exploited and oppressed class. As such, it can and does struggle against its exploitation and oppression. But note that there is no necessary and a priori reason why this struggle should acquire the dimensions, potency, and content that it did. An exploited class could easily remain in a state of transitory and impotent revolt, invent a new religion, etc. But why must this struggle necessarily be transformed from a, quote, immediate to a, quote, historical struggle? Why must it go beyond the framework of the existing society and lead to the construction of a new one? And what kind of new society? In short, why must the proletariat, by its situation, become a revolutionary class? And of what kind of revolution are we speaking anyway? It would be useless to search for an answer to these questions in an objective dynamics, or rather mechanics of contradictions and the collapse of capitalism. Aside from the fact that such dynamics are a pure fantasy, nothing guarantees in advance that capitalism's collapse would automatically result in the appearance of a classless society. In fact, it could very well lead to the, quote, destruction of the two classes in struggle, end quote, to quote Marx. Moreover, the emergence of a classless society cannot be conceived without active human mediation, in this case the proletariat, and so we are brought back to the previous question. It would also be useless to invoke the effects of the process of capital accumulation, leading to the growth of, quote, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and discipline, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Discipline, unity and organization in view of what? What objectives exist beyond the struggle against misery and exploitation? What kind of organization of production and society takes the place of capitalist expropriation? These questions go to the very heart of Marxism and are neither trivial nor resolved. This is demonstrated by the well-known fact that certain Marxists, e.g. Kautsky and Lenin, have answered them negatively. When considering the proletariat's, quote, objective, end quote, situation, They agree that it is not a revolutionary class, but only reformist, trade unionist. Revolutionary consciousness is introduced into the proletariat from the outside by socialist ideologues who come from the bourgeoisie. But before rushing to condemn this position, one should try to see what in Marxism is opposed to this view, and, above all, what could be opposed to it. Indeed, it is hard to deny the explicit manifestations of the proletarian struggle have been overwhelmingly trade unionist and reformist. For each of the few revolutions or great political mobilizations that occur each century, one can count tens of thousands of strikes each year. And, whatever the nature of its contents, the workers' participation in the unions and their support for, quote, reformist, end quote, parties have been far more extensive than their adherence to those political organizations calling for a socialist revolution. It may be objected, of course, that in many cases, the working class initially formed political organizations in which the roots of unions may be found. But this objection is worthless if it is true that these unions and their demands have for the most part absorbed the fundamental interests of the working class. The Leninist thesis concerns the essential contents of the, quote, spontaneous tendencies of the working class. The objection can be easily inverted. From where do these parties and militants emerge? Are they purely spontaneous products of the workers? A consistent Leninist would respond that the refutation rather confirms what he says. By itself, and, quote, spontaneously, end quote, the working class cannot rise above a trade unionist consciousness and activity. Sometimes it cannot even rise to this level without the intervention of organizations and militants. Footnote. It matters little whether, as Trotsky claimed, Lenin later abandoned the position of what is to be done. End footnote. These organizations and militants are political insofar as they are explicitly defined by reference to a permanent organization and activity, a design of power, a program of socioeconomic transformation, a general conception of society, an ideology. As such, they are and can only be the product of the period's culture, i.e. bourgeois culture. Why invoke the role of political organizations in the constitution of the German unions, when the creation of these organizations was marked by the decisive influence of such individuals as Marx, Lassalle, and others less well known, behind which lies German idealism and English political economy? One could add French utopian socialism. This would not make the writing of Saint-Simon and Fourier products of the proletariat. In short, without revolutionary theory, no revolutionary politics, and this theory is not, as such, the product of the proletariat. Trotsky wrote, in one of his last texts, quote, scientific socialism is the conscious expression, ... of the instinctive and elemental drive of the proletariat to reconstruct society on communist beginnings, end quote. A dandy sentence that raises more problems than it solves. Footnote. Trotsky, In Defense of Marxism. What is the meaning and origin of this, quote, elemental and instinctive drive, end quote? Without quibbling over words, is it too much to ask on what grounds, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, can scientifically assert itself as the conscious expression of the elemental and instinctive drives of a social category? Without quibbling over words, is it too much to ask on what grounds, quote, scientific socialism can scientifically assert itself as the conscious expression of the elemental and instinctive drives of a social category? And if these drives emerge in response to its situation in capitalist society, why does this situation require or induce the particular response, which must in the end lead to the, quote, reconstruction of society on communist beginnings, end quote? Finally, who deciphers these drives, on what basis, and how can one recognize the, quote, elemental and instinctive, end quote, drive of which the very method of deciphering is but a conscious expression? Being unable to exhibit and reproduce its own genesis in terms of the situation and activity of the proletariat, this conception remains on the same level as the Leninist conception and manifests the same antinomy. In the Leninist conception, the proletariat's, quote, historical interests, end quote, can neither be understood nor formulated by the proletariat itself, but only by a theory having a bourgeois origin. In the Trotskyist conception, the, quote, conscious expression, end quote, of the elemental and instinctive drive of the proletariat enters the world armed from head to toe without waiting for the proletariat to reflect upon it. Both conceptions display the same monstrously ahistorical attitude. In a sense, nothing really happens during the entire capitalist period and the workers' struggles which mark it. Either the party, aided by objective circumstances, manages to indoctrinate the workers with the socialist truths that its science has from the very beginning allowed it to attain, or else the, quote, elemental and instinctive drive, end quote, finally succeeds in raising itself to the level of its long and eagerly awaited, quote, conscious expression, end quote. Nor is even the Luxemburgian conception all that different. One can admire, of course, the feeling and spirit that animated Luxemburg's statement. Quote, historically, the errors committed by a truly revolutionary movement are confined more fruitfully Historically, the errors committed by a truly revolutionary movement are infinitely more fruitful than the infallibility of the cleverest central committee, end quote. Luxemburg. And one must approve its polemical political intent. But one must also ask, and what are these errors, and what is this infallibility? If scientific socialism exists, as Luxemburg always believed, there is no room for the, quote, errors, end quote, of the masses. At best, there can only be a pedagogical tolerance of them. One can speak of processes of trial and error only if one knows what in relation to which they are trials and errors. Hegel has said that, quote, to knowledge, the goal is necessarily fixed as the sequence of its progression, end quote. Sorry, there's a footnote I just missed. It was the last sentence. And the same can be said for Marx. Quote, proletarian revolutions, criticize themselves constantly, come back to the apparently accomplished in order to begin afresh, deride with unmerciful thoroughness the inadequacies, weaknesses, and paltriness of their first attempts, recoil ever and on from the indefinite prodigiousness of their own aims, until, all turning back all turning back is impossible, and the conditions themselves cry out, hic rotus, hic salta, end quote. Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' selected works, Moscow, 1962, end footnote. Alright, now let me repeat the sentence that I said before I read the footnote. Hegel that has said that, quote, to knowledge, the goal is necessarily fixed as the sequence of its progression, end quote. In these conditions, then, the history of the proletariat can best be viewed as an educational novel, the story of the proletariat's years of apprenticeship. Paradoxically, however, the contents of the apprenticeship must be both absolutely definite. Historical materialism predicts the mode of production that must follow capitalism, and absolutely indefinite. One does not prepare recipes for the socialist cooks of the future. Footnote. Contrary to current mythology, the Bolsheviks came to power without any program of social transformation. They applied measures opposed to those which they had earlier proposed, and acted only on a day-to-day basis. Many Marxists, such as Luxemburg, severely criticized their actions. End footnote. Neither of these conceptions, in fact, no Marxist conception whatever, has the means to think the history of the workers' movement, which must therefore remain unintelligible according to the Marxist own criterion of intelligibility. This criterion, in turn, is profoundly linked to the Marxist political attitudes. Thus, for example, in its empirical reality, the proletariat has usually supported either reformist or totalitarian, bureaucratic, Stalinist organizations and tendencies. To speak, as one often does, of, quote, errors and, quote, betrayals is simply laughable. Errors and betrayals on this scale cease to be simply errors and betrayals. Clearly, the policies of the reformist or Stalinist bureaucracies neither, quote, deceive nor, quote, betray anyone, but only act in their own interests. Having recognized this, one can then advance to a sociological interpretation of the workers' bureaucracy, an interpretation which is nonetheless incomplete, either in capitalism or in the so-called workers' state. The bureaucracy is conceived as a stratum that has succeeded in creating privileges for itself, which it henceforth defends with the support of the, quote, labor aristocracy. But this obviously concerns only the bureaucracy, and perhaps the, quote, labor aristocracy, leaving aside the question of why the proletariat continues to support policies which don't serve its own interests. The only answer one can obtain to this question is found in the standard phrase about the, quote, reformist illusions of the proletariat, end quote. Thus historical materialism becomes historical illusionism, and the history of humanity becomes the history of the illusions of the revolutionary class. Here we have indeed a class called upon to effect the most radical overturning ever undertaken, the passage from, quote, prehistory to, quote, to real, quote, history, end quote. The conscious construction of socialism, as Trotsky said, but a class which, for over a century, has fallen prey to tenacious illusions and which manifests an astonishing capacity to believe in deceitful and treacherous, quote, directions, end quote, or in any case, directions hostile to its own interests. And why should this ever change? The only possible answer in this context is that the collapse of capitalism will destroy the objective basis for the proletariat's illusions, reformist or otherwise. This is the reason, in fact, for the paranoia of contemporary, quote, Marxists, end quote, who feel compelled to predict every quarter the, quote, great crisis, end quote. That is only around the corner, and what are we supposed to do while waiting for this crisis? If logic dictates, almost nothing, but logic, of course, has little to do with these matters. One sees here the profound duplicity of these Marxists. The revolutionary class, charged with superhuman tasks, is at the same time profoundly irresponsible. One cannot impute responsibility to it for what happens to it, nor even what it does. It is completely innocent. The proletariat is the constitutional monarch of history. Responsibility belongs to its ministers, to the old leadership who either erred in judgment or betrayed them. Responsibility for the proletariat, in other words, belongs to us who, once again and despite all obstacles, will construct the new leadership, which will, this time, neither betray nor err, and will take responsibility for history and the innocent proletariat. In this approach lies the source of the unavoidable bureaucratic substitutionalism of these same, quote, Marxists, end quote. We can begin to understand the proletariat and the proletariat's history only after we rid ourselves of the ontological schemes dominating inherited thought, including its most recent variety, Marxism, i.e., after we admit that new significations have emerged through the activity of this social category instead of forcing the effects of this activity into previously given conceptual pigeonholes. We do not have to interpret the proletariat's activity by reference to an imminent finality or a, quote, historical mission, end quote. Such a mission is purely and simply a myth. On the contrary, we must become absorbed in considering the proletariat's actual reality, without forgetting what we know from elsewhere, but also without allowing ourselves to be obsessed by it. Above all, here we have to learn something new. We must ask ourselves to what degree the making of the proletariat reveals a tendency, and what its significance would be. Nor can we explain the proletariat by reducing it to the, quote, objective conditions, end quote, in which it finds itself, to its situation in the relations of production, or in the totality of the social context, not because these conditions should be neglected, but because they have neither a determinate content nor signification, since they have almost no existence outside of the proletariat's activity. In short, we cannot consider the activity of the proletariat, if we eliminate it altogether, through the reduction of its existence to assignable ends or established causes. Proceeding in this way, in fact, collapses almost all of the categories customarily used to grasp the proletariat's activity. Similarly, we cannot consider the relations of the proletariat to its organizations under any of the traditional modes. Its organizations are not the transparent expressions and pure instruments of the proletariat that Lenin claimed them to be, nor are they simply foreign bodies which force the proletariat to submit to hostile influences? Because the proletariat has usually played a role in their formation and perpetuation, it is implicated in their existence. We can perceive nothing of modern history if we do not see that the proletariat, in and by its activity, not only creates original organizations, parties, and unions which will be imitated by other strata, including the bourgeoisie, but also establishes an original relation between a social category and its organization, just as it creates in and by its activity an unprecedented relation between a social category and the, quote, relations of production, end quote, in which it is caught. Nor can we any longer accept the distinctions between the proletariat's, quote, objective situation, its, quote, consciousness, and its, quote, acts, on the one hand, and their subsequent recomposition under the aegis of causality-finality, on the other, any more than we can assign any importance to the, quote, proletarian, or, quote, bourgeois, and, quote, origin of ideas. Still even less can we imagine the existence of a rigorous and univocal connection between the origin of ideas and their function. The meaning of historical ideas is not closed once and for all, supposing that such significations exist in any domain. Assigning precise origins to them does little to clarify their contents, inasmuch as the ideas are still living and are continually taking up socio-historical activity that enriches, impoverishes, and transforms them, and even goes so far as to interpret them in diametrically opposed ways. If we can circumscribe the imaginary significations advanced by the bourgeoisie that correspond to the socio-historical transformation which it brought about, it is precisely because they are not simple, quote, ideas. Rather, they are coextensive with an actual historical process that has lasted several centuries and which embraces the whole planet, giving rise to the activity of the proletariat. And because this activity must necessarily take up the instituted definition of reality, it necessarily begins by taking up, quote, bourgeois ideas, long before they are refined into questions of German idealism or English political economy. Ironically, the instituted definition of reality can, in fact, be conserved by an apparently revolutionary ideology, the best example provided by Marxism itself, while more obscure activities unconcerned with theorization can profoundly challenge it. Here the distinction between what is, quote, bourgeois and what is, quote, proletarian is not given to us in advance. It is the proletariat's activity which alone establishes this distinction and which alone can maintain it. In this way, and only in this way, can one understand the problem of, quote, degeneration, end quote. Whether it be that of the trade unions or the October Revolution, we can also see here that the distinction between what is, quote, reformist and what is, quote, revolutionary is also not given in advance, since, once again, we cannot deduce a concept of revolution from a general theory of history or from the working class's, quote, objective situation. Instead, we have to distinguish between radical revolution and the actual activity of the proletariat. This is no longer a theoretical distinction, but a political one, which implicates our own activity. We must recognize that we are caught in a circle, and that the illusion of an absolute foundation must be destroyed. A revolutionary interpretation of the history of the workers' movement cannot be founded by our choice. Our choice is not free in the face of this history. It cannot interpret in any way it pleases, nor would it be what it is without this history, nor does this history impose an interpretation. Unless we consider its signification for us, this history cannot force a choice upon us. It is in terms of this orientation that the study of the history of the workers' movement must be resumed, an immense task which will not begin here. Instead, we will merely try to make the preceding considerations more precisely through several examples. The German unions, the first example we will consider, could not have been founded without the work of organizations and political militants that were influenced by a number of ideologists, including Marx. But would Marx have written what he did about the Silesian weavers, Chartists, the Canuts, the Luddites, and the French socialist workers? What the hell is a Canut? It's a new word to me. And my internet's not working. Anyway, without these movements and experience, would Marx have been able to break the, quote, utopian socialism, end quote? How strange the obstinacy of those who, beginning with Engels himself, insist on seeing Marxism as essentially the continuation of German idealism, English political economy, and even utopian socialism, French or otherwise. One could easily demonstrate that, in essence, the social and political themes in Marx's work had already been engendered and explicitly formulated between 1790 and 1840 by the nascent workers' movement, particularly in England. Footnote: much of what is sociologically true and important in the labor theory of value was early on part of common consciousness of English workers. See Thompson's more than adequate documentation of this in his The Making of the English Working Class. End footnote. But this obfuscation is not accidental, since what has been considered important in Marxism has always been its pseudo-scientific side, which certainly does come from Hegel and Ricardo, and not its core, which was created by and taken from the workers and without which Marxism would be just another philosophical system. But can this creation and this movement be attributed to pure spontaneity on the part of the proletariat as such? Or, on the contrary, does the workers' movement only rigorously reflect and express the proletariat's, quote, objective situation? Neither the one nor the other, nor even both. Such expressions are meaningless here. The movements of this period, the English one in particular, are all directly situated in the wake of the French Revolution. They are conditioned by the tremendous shaking of the established order that is provoked, and are nourished by the ceaseless effervescence and accelerated circulation of ideas which resulted from it as much as by the contents of these ideas. On the one hand, there is no break in continuity from Chartism to the radical, quote, reform movements, to Owenism, to the unions, both legal and clandestine, that had already appeared during the Napoleonic Wars, and to which the political movements, notably the corresponding societies, which proliferated in England from 1790 to 1798, wherein the participation of the laborers and mechanics rapidly became very important, but where the remainder of the contingent was provided by, quote, enlightened and, quote, radical bourgeoisie, and even by some gentlemen, who, from the beginning and for a long time afterward, brought to it ideas showing the influence of the American Constitution, and above all, what was said and done in Paris. These are, quote, bourgeois ideas, if one is to believe the acknowledged and fairly absurd interpretation. Yet the fertile soil on which these ideas fell in England had been worked over by many lively religious sects, whose imprint was deep on the English population, and whose influence contributed to the subsequent evolution toward deism initially and atheism later. What we are saying is that the birth of the English workers' movement was neither a pure act of spontaneity, nor a reflex conditioned by the objective situation, nor even a rational elaboration of the consequences of this situation. On the contrary, it is impossible to conceive of this movement in its content outside the multidimensional contributions of the technical and economic upheavals of the period, but also for the bourgeoisie's political activity, the international situation at its evolution, national traditions, sometimes even preceding the feudal era, religious movements, quote, bourgeois ideology and philosophical critique. These contributions can all be located with certainty, but at no moment can one truly isolate and put into some order a set of factors which could provide the necessary and sufficient conditions for the, quote, result that is studied. All the less so, since in 1977 we still do not know what this result is, not because we lack information, but because this, quote, result has not yet ceased to yield results, for we are still implicated in the same historical movement of which it is a part, just as the, quote, result of October 1917 continues through 1918, 1921, 1927, 1936, 1941, 1945, 1953, 1956, and into the present. So, what of the influence of bourgeois ideas? It certainly existed. Right from the start, liberty and equality became the battle cries of the English workers' movement, both a meaning radically opposed to their, quote, bourgeois meaning. The workers appropriated bourgeois culture, and in doing so, they reversed its signification. They read Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Volney. Earlier, it looks like my internet's temporarily working. When I was looking for Knut, it says the Knuts were Lyonnais, or like people from Lyon. I don't know how to say it. It says like Lyonnais, but I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. But Lyonnais silk workers, often working on jacquard looms. They are primarily found in the Croix-Rousse neighborhood of Lyon in the 19th century. Although the term generally refers to Lyonnais silk workers in the nearby commune of Les Arbres are also called Knuts. And it would appear that Volney refers to Constantin François de Chasseboeuf, Comte de Volney, or Volney, I don't know how to say it, who lived from 1757 to 1820, and was a French philosopher, abolitionist, writer, Orientalist, politician, who was made commander of the Legion of Honor in 1804, Count of the Empire in 1808, and a peer of France by Louis XVIII. He was at first surnamed Bois-Guiresse after his father's estate, but afterwards assumed the name of Volney, which he had created as a contraction of Voltaire and Ferny. So that's who Volney is. Back to the text. They read Paine, Voltaire, and Volney, but was it in these authors that they found the idea that capital is only accumulated labor, or that the government of a country should be nothing but the union of the associations of producers? Moreover, one must see how they materially appropriated bourgeois culture. From 1800 to 1840, the English proletariat became literate almost entirely by its own efforts. The activity of the working class incorporated the instruments and contents of the existing culture, while conferring a new signification upon them. Sometimes it would take up significations that even preceded the bourgeois epoch. The suppression of any permanent leadership emerged as a tendency typical of mass workers' movements as soon as they attained a certain degree of combativity and autonomy. Whether such a tendency would take the form of the instant revocability of delegates, as in the Commune, Soviets, Workers' Councils, or shop stewards in England, or of the rotation of participants imposed a responsibility, as was the case in the English unions long before they became bureaucratized. And what is the, quote, working class activity during this period? Can it be defined by its situation in production? Absolutely not. This connection that has traditionally been sought between the birth of a real workers' movement and the appearance of a large-scale cotton industry collapses in light of contemporary research. Such a connection distorts the facts in order to fit them into an a priori schema. The factories became the center of a movement which developed after 1830, but most of its ideas, organizational forms, and its, quote, class consciousness were developed in the struggles of the preceding period that had been waged by, quote, plebeian strata of every sort, and most particularly by artisans, i.e., according to the Marxist conception, by potential, quote, bourgeois. Let us now consider the relations of production typical in capitalism. Based on the fact that one social stratum actually controls the means of production, capital, while another disposes of its labor power, these relations are manifested according to the Marxist conception in the buying and selling of labor power. But what is really sold here, and in exchange for what? A quantity of the, quote, commodity, labor power, in exchange for a quantity of money, i.e. wages. But are these quantities defined? Apparently so. So many hours of labor for a given wage. But in reality, they are absolutely not defined. Labor power is not a commodity like any other. Not only does labor power, quote, produce more than it costs the buyer, end quote, but there is no way to define its concrete contents in advance. As such, it is a commodity only in a formal sense. In the last analysis, it is not a commodity at all. When the capitalist has bought a ton of coal, he knows how much heat he can extract from it, and his business has ended. But when he has bought a day's work, his troubles have only begun. What he can get out of it as actual work becomes the object of a struggle that does not cease during the entire working day. Neither the techniques available nor, quote, economic laws, end quote, can determine what is actually an hour of labor. Rather, This determination emerges each time in a constantly changing manner out of the struggle between capitalists and workers, hence as a result of the workers' activity. One sees, therefore, that the wage, considered as a rate of exchange between units of money and units of actual work yield, is indeterminate. Quote, $2 an hour means nothing, end quote, means nothing if one does not know what a, quote, hour, end quote, of work means. Certainly capitalism has responded in the attempt to tie the wage to what is actually yielded in the work, but this only displaces the struggle to a more general level. Henceforth, the struggle involves the determination of work standards, time and motion studies, quality control, job classifications, the distribution of tasks. The distribution of tasks among workers, etc., such that the very organization of work and of the enterprise ultimately becomes the stakes in this struggle. Footnote. On all these points, see Sur le contenu de Socialisme, Part 3, and le mouvement révolutionnaire sur le capitalisme moderne. The contents of socialism, all of those are on this channel, as well as I think it's Modern Capitalism and Revolution Today is how that's translated, and that's all on here. It's kind of a long video though, but you should listen to it anyway. All variants of Marxism have to the end remained blind to this struggle. Footnote. Marx is well known. Oh shit, no. Did I read that? Whoops. I think I skipped some shit. This conclusion remains valid even if one rejects the idea of labor power as a commodity, and if one maintains that the essence of the relations of production lies in the division between managers and those who carry out their directives. What we are describing here means that, beyond the formal and, quote, official definition of functions, the actual distinction between management and those who are managed is not, nor can it ever be, defined in advance for all time. Rather, it is constantly displaced as a function of the struggle which unfolds in the enterprise. The workers' implicit and informal struggle that attacks the capitalist organization of production signifies, ipso facto, that the workers create in opposition to the latter a counter-organization which, while certainly partial, fragmentary, and unstable, is nonetheless effective. Without this, not only would the workers be unable to resist management, but they would not even be able to achieve their work as such. The effects of this struggle have been decisive. On the economic plane, it has determined actual development as much as, if not more than, the explicit and official struggle over wages. The results of the informal struggle are translated into the distribution of revenues, the rate and orientation of capital accumulation, and the level of employment. The informal struggles has played a crucial role in orienting the technical and organizational aspects of production. In their evolution towards systems that are increasingly independent of the individual worker or group of workers, that this orientation has until now failed, and that in the face of this failure one observes attempts at, quote, job enrichment and, quote, autonomous teams of workers, does not invalidate but rather confirms what we are saying. Ultimately, there is no sphere of social life that has not been affected. All variants of Marxism have to the end remained blind to this struggle. This blindness is not accidental. Footnote. Marx, as is well known, extracts and abstracts from that struggle the half which corresponds to the capitalist activity, the, quote, compression of the pores of the workday, end quote, letting the worker appear as a pure passive object of this activity. The resistance that the workers can oppose to this activity in production and outside the factory, in union agitation, etc., is in no way different, in this perspective, from the simple resistance of an inert material. Marx's moral indignation is obvious in every line, but the logic of his inquiry is that which one could apply to an inanimate thing. In the two instances where workers' quote, resistance, end quote, is mentioned, in the first volume of Capital, in connections with control and supervision, then with reference to piecework, is presented as doomed to fail. End footnote. All variants of Marxism have to the end remained blind to this struggle. This blindness is not accidental. As autonomous, anonymous collective activity, the workers' informal struggle has no place in traditional conceptions. Practically speaking, it is of no value to the formal organizations, unions, or parties, since they cannot control it, they cannot, quote, capitalize upon it. Theoretically, it destroys the cornerstone of Marxist, quote, science, i.e. the idea of labor power as commodity, and ultimately demolishes the very idea of, quote, economic laws. At the same time, it does away with the other cornerstone of Marxist socioeconomics, the idea that the capitalist factory represents a, quote, rational and, quote, scientific organization, and that the evolution of technique is in itself logical and optimal. Footnote. These consequences immediately extend to academic economics too, and more generally to every economic theory known to date. Every theory of this type must postulate that the work yield, or product of labor, is strictly a function of the state of technique and of the quantity of capital, a postulate that the activity of the workers makes completely meaningless. End footnote. The proletariat's activity has generally been known and recognized only insofar as it has been explicit. This is not due to the rather banal fact that this type of struggle is easier to observe. Marx spent his life attempting to disengage the hidden essence of the capitalist economy. Rather, the essential reason for this lies more in the fact that the explicit struggles, as much in the objectives that they strive for, quote economic, quote political, demands in the narrow sense of the term, as in the forms that they take, strikes, demonstrations, votes, insurrections, correspond more or less to the concepts and categories that a theoretician has already constructed, to the characteristics and variables of the instituted regime that are considered fundamental to the theory, and to the forms of action that are given value because they can be inserted into the theoretician's strategy. The schema operating in the background here is always that of an individual or collective subject, proposing clear and distinct ends and posing the actions to be taken as means to attain these ends. But the proletariat's implicit daily struggle can in no way be grasped in this perspective, no more than the daily pressure by women over the last 100 years and by the youth during the last 25 years can adequately be summed up in their explicit organizational activity, which represents only the tip of the iceberg. But what is really at stake in the workers' implicit daily struggle, which can also explode into broad daylight as in the case of many wildcat strikes? We have already indicated the economic aspects and effects of this struggle, but it would be absurd to see in the economic sphere the struggle's only or even its most essential meaning. In the first place, even if its exclusive motivation were the defense or increase of real wages, this motivation is channeled through the means by which workers challenge the organization and conditions of work that have been imposed by the firm. These two aspects are both actually and logically inseparable, since what is aimed at is not a wage in the abstract, but a wage relative to a certain amount of labor. In the second place, these work conditions, recently discovered by trained unionists and Marxists of different tendencies, after having long been ignored or condescendingly called, quote, local grievances, end quote, induce struggles whose meaning reaches far beyond the question of wages. When workers launch wildcat strikes in order to obtain a 15-minute coffee break, unionists and Marxists alike tend to consider this a trivial demand reflecting the workers' backwardness. But it was the unionists and Marxists themselves who were trivial and backward. Such demands, against their very foundation of the capitalist enterprise and of society. Such demands question the very foundation of the capitalist enterprise and of society. Against the principle that man exists for the sake of production, they propose an organization of production centered around the needs of the human producer. When the shop floor collective establishes norms that informally sanction both the, quote, slackers and, quote, speeders, when it constantly constitutes and reconstitutes itself in, quote, informal groups that correspond to both the requirements of the work process and to personal affinities, it can only be viewed as actively opposing to capitalist principles, new principles of productive and social organization, and a new view of work. In the traditional conception, all these manifestations can only be considered, quote, reformist, because they do not explicitly question the power instituted in society, and because, for the most part, they can be accommodated within the latter. But such criteria are formal, and in the last analysis, empty. For us, these struggles clearly manifest an activity as radical as any other. While they do not question the authority of the established power, they do undermine its foundation, i.e. the capitalist definition of reality. That a revolutionary transformation of society would eliminate established power scarcely needs to be recalled. But this elimination in itself, which revolutionary currents have always been obsessed with, would change nothing if other, more profound modifications were not already underway, modifications which cannot be carried out in a day and which can alone confer a revolutionary meaning to any elimination of established power. All historical experience since 1917 confirms this, if such confirmation still be needed. We cannot, therefore, reduce the socio-historical activity of the proletariat to the abstract concept of, quote, reform and, quote, revolution that are imposed on it by strategic and therefore bureaucratic thought. Instead of allowing itself to be informed by this activity, such thought wants at all costs to be measured to it. Since such thought wants at all costs to measure it by the standard of its own pseudo-theoretical schemas, and can see it in it only that which corresponds to its obsession with power. We must be on guard against the illusion that the meanings borne by the proletariat's activity can be reduced to a simple system of concepts of whatever kind. The proletariat has for 2 centuries profoundly modified not only its situation in capitalist society, but also capitalist society itself. In this activity we can discover a content that constitutes a profound break with the capitalist order. Yet, we cannot neglect another aspect of the proletariat struggle, that which appears in its actual results. These results translate into changes of the system. These changes have in fact allowed the system to function and survive. Those in italics. I don't know if I've already said that in this video, but when I reread something, it's because it's in italics. They have conditioned the continuous expansion of capitalist production by the continued expansion of its internal markets. Observe the reversal of the Machiavellianism of the would-be revolutionary strategists to support wage struggles because their success leads to the system's ruin means. In reality, to contribute to the system's survival. In the Hegelian Marxist philosophical framework, the true end of the operation evidently does not lie in what the author of the operations intends, but in what actually results from it. In this case, the rationality and finality inherent in the struggle for higher wages was the continued expansion and consolidation of the capitalist economy, which would have collapsed an incalculable number of times had real wages remained at their 1820 levels. Or, in other words, the objective assigned to the working class, the historical role ascribed to its position in capitalist relations of production, was to maintain capitalism in spite of all that the capitalists represented as their immediate aims. If the cunning of reason is at work in history, it has made the proletariat not the gravedigger, but the savior of capitalism. An analogous conclusion follows in the Hegelian Marxist framework if one looks at the revolutionary activity of the proletariat, where it has not failed. This activity has resulted, for the moment, a moment which has lasted almost 60 years, in the totalitarian power of the bureaucracy. Of course, quote, it is not a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the whole of the proletariat at the moment considers as its aim. The question is what the proletariat is. The question is what the proletariat is, and what, consequent on that being, it will be compelled to do, end quote. Marx, the Holy Family. The absurdity of these conclusions, or excuse me, did I say footnote? Well, that was a footnote. Marx, the Holy Family, end footnote. The absurdity of these conclusions reminds us once again of the absurdity of the ideology that renders them inevitable. It does not spare us from the need to reflect on the immense questions posed by the implication or involvement of the proletariat in the society it lives in, and by our own political involvement, without which the history of the workers' movement would be for us, at best, only a dead object of knowledge. Through its implicit and explicit activity, the proletariat determines the relations to the means of production as much, if not more, than it reciprocally is determined by them. This state of affairs differs essentially from the institution of new relations of production which result from the bourgeoisie's activity. It is not a general property of, quote, classes, unquote, or even of, quote, exploited classes, unquote. This activity is conditioned by a set of unique and specific factors characteristic of capitalism. The effect of these factors can be summarized as follows. The proletariat is not forced into an all-or-nothing struggle. It can defend itself against exploitation because it can day after day attack certain aspects of the organization of production, of the enterprise, and of capitalist society. This possibility, in turn, is based on both the intrinsically contradictory character of this organization, which simultaneously requires and excludes the participation of the workers in the management of their work, and the social, political, and ideological situation created by the bourgeoisie which, during its accession to power, dissolved traditional significations that sanctified power and social hierarchy, and claimed that henceforth only, quote, reason was to be sovereign. All this can be seen in the political movements of the All this can be seen in the political movement of the working class, just as clearly as in the economic struggles that we have considered above. Since its origins in France and England, the working class has found support in, quote, bourgeois ideas, but only in order to transform their meaning and ultimately to transcend them. The struggle for political and social rights is not only made possible by existing conditions, but these conditions tend to make it impossible as well. The struggle is actually against these conditions. Moreover, the struggle is nourished by its own transcendence, for the fundamental fact in this respect is that the active strata of the proletariat began almost immediately to question the social order, attack the property and domination of the bourgeoisie, and aimed at a universal organization of producers, which they also sought to make identical to the organization of society. The critique against the exclusive preoccupation with the proletariat's explicit struggles in no way means that one could for a moment underestimate the decisive importance of its political activity. It is in and by the latter that in the space of a couple of decades, the dispersed and profoundly heterogeneous categories of workers, the, quote, working classes, end quote, actually constituted themselves as a class, before capitalism had, quote, unified, end quote, them objectively. I think that's basically how E.P. Thompson understands class formation. Indeed, this constitution was virtually completed before the middle of the 19th century in England and France. In this activity, the workers not only asserted themselves as a class in capitalist society, but also as a class against the society. In an explicit and self-conscious fashion, they brought forward a design called for the radical reconstruction of society and the abolition of classes. This design was to be carried out by the institution of new forms of struggle and organization, such as the mass political party and the Union, which long retained a revolutionary character, and which in England expressed for decades the power of the rank and file and of direct democracy. The design was to be carried out by the institution of new forms of struggle and organization, such as the mass political party and the Union, which long retained a revolutionary character, and which in England expressed for decades the power of the rank and file and of direct democracy. What Lenin, in What Is to Be Done, would call with condescending scorn, quote, primitive democracy, end quote. It would culminate in the creation of new institutions of mass power, the Commune, the Soviets, the workers' councils. In short, a revolutionary socio-historical project will be born in the activity of the working class. Ever since this time, these different aspects, the daily struggle implicit in production, the explicit economic or political struggles, and the revolutionary project, can no longer be separated, quote, objectively or, quote, subjectively, except in a derivative and secondary manner. Consequently, it it is impossible to trace a line absolutely separating the, quote, immediate from the, quote, historical. The proletariat's activity in history, then, establishes a new relation between an exploited stratum and the relations of production, and of course between the stratum and the fact of exploitation itself. It also establishes a new relation between an exploited stratum and the instituted social system, insofar as the struggle of this stratum becomes capable of co-determining the evolution of the instituted social system. Finally, and above all, it establishes a new relation between a social stratum. One second. A social stratum. Finally, and above all, it establishes a new relation between a social stratum and society and history as such. It establishes a new relation between a social stratum and society and history as such, insofar as this stratum's activity brings about an explicit perspective regarding the radical transformation of the institution of society and of the course of history. Only by referring to these significations, which go beyond simply empirical criteria, can one conceptualize what has been for an entire historical period the self-making of the working class and of the workers' movement. For us, then, the question of the workers' movement and the workers' movement's history, which is inextricably bound to the question of the political and ideological currents that have influenced it, quote, utopian, end quote, socialism, Marxism, and anarchism, is not simply or essentially a theoretical question. A generalized dislocation confronts contemporary society which disturbs it far more than any mere, quote, economic crisis could. It can be perceived by all and is admitted daily by the very representatives of the dominant system. A genuine political activity and design can only exist in the face of this dislocation if it realizes the full depth of the social question and views the latter from a perspective calling for a radical transformation. Such an activity can therefore only be conceived as the historical resumption of the revolutionary project engendered by the workers' movement. There can be no revolutionary politics which does not attempt to explicate and elucidate its relation to its roots in the workers' movement. The history of the workers' movement is the history of the activity of human subjects belonging to a socio-economic category created by capitalism. Through their activity and that of others who fought at their side, this category has transformed itself into a class of a type for which history offers no analogies. It has transformed itself by turning from the passivity, fragmentation, and competition that capitalism has sought to impose on it, to activity, solidarity, and collectivization, thereby reversing the implications of the capitalist organization of work. It is invented daily, both in and out of the factories, ever renewed rejoinders to exploitation. It has given rise to principles hostile to capitalism, and has created original forms of organization and struggle. It has attempted to unite itself beyond national borders. At decisive moments of its history, it has created universal institutions embodying its collective power, and has shown itself capable of acting with a political audacity and depth rarely equaled by other collectivities in history. Transformed from an object of exploitation into a determinate social force, in the history of the last 150 years, the working class has also transformed capitalist society, by the direct and constant pressure on the system, and by the necessity imposed on the capitalist to anticipate its reactions. But the tentative, quote, result of this transformation has been the disappearance of the workers' movement as an original and autonomous socio-historical force. The working class, as in the proper sense of the term, has increasingly tended to become a minority in modern capitalist countries, and, what is even more important, it no longer manifests itself or regards itself as a class. To be sure, almost all of those who work are now dependently employed. What this means, in effect, is that it no longer makes much sense to speak in terms of classes. There is even less of a revolutionary predestination inherent in the, quote, objective situation of wage and salary earners than was attributed to the situation of industrial workers. What is decisive in this respect is not the descriptive socioeconomic characteristics, but the activity by which human beings act out social conflict and, more precisely, constitute it as a social conflict. What is decisive in this respect is not the descriptive socioeconomic characteristics, but the activity by which human beings act out social conflict, and more precisely, constitute social conflict as social conflict. What is decisive for the forms of what is decisive are the forms of organization and struggle that they invent, the results of these struggles, and finally the capacity of these human beings, be it partial, infrequent, or intermittent, to aim at the social whole and assert themselves as willing to take charge of the organization and functioning of society. From all these perspectives, it is clear that one can today neither maintain a privileged position for the proletariat in the traditional sense, nor mechanically extend the characteristics of the proletariat to all those who are now wage and salary earners. Nor is it possible, finally, to claim that all wage and salary earners behave as a class, even in an embryonic form. The alienation of contemporary capitalist society, the contradictions in the profound erosion of the system, and the struggle against the latter in an infinite number of ways, are experienced daily by all strata of modern society, except the controlling heights. The struggles of wage and salary earners apart from the industrial proletariat, of students and the young, of growing numbers of women, of certain intellectuals and scientists, and of ethnic minorities, revive what was important in the exemplary struggles of the industrial proletariat, the questioning of specific aspects of the system's oppressive organization, and the potential questioning of the system in general. Worker struggles over working conditions still go very far, but no farther than the questioning by women, students, and youth of the educational system, of the traditional type and function of knowledge, and of the patriarchal family. The proletariat struggles could be said to be privileged over all other struggles only by maintaining that, in a revolutionary transformation of society, production and work have disproportionate significance. But this is not the case, which is not to say that one can reject or neglect their meaning. The interrelation of all aspects of social life, and of the problems that its transformation would pose, does not allow one to define a central and sovereign point that would dominate all others. But the idea of such a point, and its identification with production and work, is an essential part of the Marxist metaphysics, both in its, quote, monism and in its productivism, which is itself only the sequel to capitalist productivism. That the capitalist enterprise has been, and, to a certain degree, remains, a privileged place of socialization under capitalism is certainly true and important, but that does not reduce the importance of other places of socialization, both those which exist now, and what is more important, those which are yet to be created. Both those which exist now, and what is more important, those which are to be created. Inversely, if one considers the most difficult moment of a revolutionary social transformation, i.e. the problem of taking charge of the global functioning of society and of explicitly aiming at the social whole, then the experience of the last 3 decades in modern capitalist countries demonstrates the privatization and social and political apathy have penetrated the working strata even more deeply than the others. This situation does away with the question of Marxism as a purportedly revolutionary theoretico-political conception, and as an ideology that claims to possess the solution to the problem of political activity under capitalism. It provides the ultimate internal critique of Marxism, independently of any purely theoretical critique, and even independence of the final historical destiny of Marxism as, in effect, the ideology of the bureaucracy. The workers' movement has for a long time, and in many countries, coincided with Marxism. This relation has obviously played an essential role in the evolution of both. In itself, this poses many difficult problems, which cannot be discussed here, but the workers' movement has not been Marxism, and Marxism has not been the workers' movement. What value Marxism has had for the workers' movement is difficult to see. As noted earlier, the understanding of the organization and functioning of capitalist society had for all practical purposes already been attained in the workers' movement during the first half of the 19th century. Marxism, however, has tended to obscure this by forcing it to enter the labyrinth of false science. It has clothed the identity of the proletariat and its, quote, self-consciousness, end quote, in the process of asserting itself, with the metaphysical mystical veil of the, quote, historical mission, end quote. what was, in the thought of Marx, the kernel of a new orientation, a kernel which was rapidly frozen, and which remains undeciphered and undecipherable for most Marxists, has not, understandably, penetrated the workers' movement. What has successfully penetrated has been, on the contrary, the dogma, the scientific religious catechism, by which Marxism has become the transmission belt of capitalist significations into the proletariat, the subtle means of ensuring the survival and domination of capitalist principles at the deepest level, the solemn theorization of the primacy of production in economics, the consecration of the technique and organization of capitalist production is inevitable, the justification of wage differences, scientism, rationalism, the blind obeisance in the face of bureaucracy, the adoration and importation into the workers' movement of models of capitalist organization and efficiency. These are only a few of the themes that firmly anchor Marxism in the capitalist universe, that specify the disastrous influence it has exercised on the workers' movement, and that show how it has predestined to become the natural ideology of the bureaucracy. That this Marxism is, quote, deformed in relation to Marx's own thought is of absolutely no importance, even if it were true, which is not the case. This is the actual historical Marxism. The other exists as best only between the lines of a few texts. These themes, and above all, what supersedes and conditions them all, the idea of the existence of a theoretical knowledge of society, history, and revolution, which provides those who possess it with the guarantee of truth and the right to judge in all senses of the term, have contributed heavily to reinforcing the influence of capitalist society on the proletariat. Today, we can elucidate the socio-historical meaning of these terms and can demonstrate that they are the substance of all that we are struggling against. The theoretical edifice of Marxism is untenable. The intelligibility it bestows to society's functioning is limited, and in the end wrong. Its attribution of a, quote, historical mission to the proletariat is mythical, as is the idea of a historical mission itself, regardless of whoever might bear it. But the main point lies elsewhere. Marxism would only be admissible, according to its own standards, if it were the, quote, conscious expression, end quote, of the aspirations and activities of the proletariat, which alone would be the truly revolutionary class struggling to abolish class society and to construct a communist one. But Marxism is not now, nor can it ever be that. In the first place, the proletariat is no longer the only true revolutionary class. There is a minority proletariat that does not pose itself as a revolutionary class, not even as a class, and whose struggle against the instituted system is, quantitatively and qualitatively, neither more nor less important than that of other social strata. In the second place, Marxism today is not the expression, conscious or otherwise, of the potentially revolutionary struggle of the proletariat or of any other stratum. Is at best indifferent and sometimes even openly hostile to them. From now on, Marxism can be effective only as an ideology in the strong sense of the term, as an invocation of fictitious entities, of pseudo-rational constructions and abstract principles that justify and hide a socio-historical practice whose true signification lies elsewhere. This practice, of course, is that of a bureaucracy that imposes its exploitation and totalitarian domination on a third of the world's population. One must truly be a Marxist to ignore this, to regard it as accidental, or to rationalize it as accidental. The connection, or, better, the lack of a rigid distinction between the workers' movement, the ideologies that invoke it, and the revolutionary project has collapsed now. This is the result of 2 centuries of history and struggle, both practical and theoretical. In a world society where every joint is cracking, where the political problem is posed as a total problem with an acuity never before known, we are always engrossed in the revolutionary project to be engendered by the working class, which continually recedes and disappears into the crowd of social actors. We find ourselves in the paradoxical situation of discerning better and better what is implied in radical socio-historical transformation, but knowing less and less who can accomplish it. But perhaps this situation is only apparently paradoxical. To search for one actor who can personify this project, a man, a party, a theory, or even a class, would be to misconceive the demands created by the socio-historical development thus far, calling for the amplification and deepening of all revolutionary activity. The revolutionary project has become such that it will have no meaning or reality if the overwhelming majority of men and women who live in contemporary society do not come to assume it and make it the active expression of their needs and desires. There can be no supreme savior and no one category responsible for humanity's fate. Thanks for listening.